Okay, guys. So, good morning. Welcome. I am Ross Burland at FXStreet Editor and Analyst. And today we are one day away from Trump taking the helm, probably the most controversial president, the 45th president of the United States. And I'm joined today by an expert panel. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Again, familiar faces: Harry Dent, financial author and founder of Dent Research; Boris, managing director and founding partner of BK Asset Management; and Joseph, chief market strategist at Worldwide Markets. So the idea, obviously, today of the panel is to look at the implications of what a Trump presidency will be for global markets, ways in which you can protect yourself, and hopefully we can identify areas here with our experts of where you can profit with a specific focus on the foreign exchange markets. So I thought a good way to start this would be to, in honor of Obama, looking at his legacy. He was the first black president for America. And I think that's a sign of how far America has come despite all of its racial divisions. But of course, throughout his 8-year term, there was a great deal of opposition to his presidency, with conspiracy that he was never born in America. And indeed, it was Donald Trump that sort of advocated that. And perhaps, Trump's rise has undoubtedly benefited from those sentiments, and his elections, for some part, was a reaction to them. So, the legacy of becoming America's first black president may have been coming with a price. He was the guy that said, yes, we can, and to some extent, yes, he did. He and his team saved America and the world from economic catastrophe after America suffered the worst recession in decades, just 2 months before he walked into the White House. So, however, his critics will probably say that nothing was done to prevent something like that from happening again. And I know, Harry, you'll be talking about that in due course. And indeed, no one was punished for the failings and frauds of the banking crisis. So there's plenty of criticism there, but all in all, he'll be remembered as no drama Obama, probably. Historians will argue over his foreign policy failings for years to come, with him asleep at the helm, or the wheel rather, with regards to Syria. And was he too weak or too strong with Israel? His failings for the Arab Spring, the Iranian nuclear deal, killing many people without trial and due process with drones, including innocent lives. And closer to home, people are saying that he didn't do enough for black civil rights. There's a lot there to go on. But at the end of the day, he will be remembered, I think, looking back, for his way of which, he did, manage the helm. He did prevent America from a huge economic collapse. So I think now we can get into Trump. Harry, I'd like to ask you, what is Trump being left to deal with, and what are his intentions, do you think?
Well, I always look at the economy much different. I don't see politicians hard to drive the economy. And to the degree there is, it's more the Fed than the president. Bill Clinton walked into the best economy in U.S. history. I predicted that whole boom and a Dow of 10,000 before he even walked into office, including a balanced budget by 1998, just because of the strength of baby boom spending and the internet technology and productivity. And Ronald Reagan walked into the end of a long decline and the worst of it, but the economy turned around with baby boom spending and some other factors while he was in office. So he came out looking great. Obama walked into the worst economy we've seen in a long time. And Trump is now walking into the third bubble, created, to me, almost solely by $13 trillion worth of money being printed worldwide, globally, by central banks. And markets are up. And now we're in a bigger bubble. And even Trump said we're in a big, ugly bubble. Well, how does he think he's going to just walk on water and take us out of a bubble bursting? Bubbles burst, and I'm sorry, that's what I just showed in my book. Every bubble in history has burst, and this bubble's way up there. And so I think Trump is walking into an economy where he's saying he's going to create 4% growth, and I'm saying that's demographically impossible. Our workforce, we've been hiring back workers laid off largely in 2008 and 9 for the last several years with all this stimulus, but we're now, as even Janet Yellen said the other day, we're at full employment or close. So we're not going to have this 150,000, 200,000 a month hiring people back. Workforce growth is people entering 20 on average and retiring at 63 on average. Those projections tell me workforce is going to contract a bit in the next several years and then grow very slowly. Productivity is the other factor for growth, workforce and population growth plus productivity. Well, productivity is back near zero and the lowest since the early 80s at the bottom of the last demographic cycle where productivity was low. So I don't see how you create 4% growth. This is not the late 70s, early 80s when Reagan came in and you had the biggest supply crisis in history. That's what high inflation is. And so supply side Republican, cut taxes, cut regulations sort of strategies would work. Trump's walking into excess supply after a biggest debt bubble boom in history, bubbles and everything. And China has overexpanded every part of their economy, infrastructures, steel production, aluminum, you name it, more than any time in history. That's why we're growing. We're only seeing inflation 0 to 2% despite unprecedented money creation. We're in a deflationary period, which requires different policies from an inflationary. So my biggest thing on Trump is really simple. He's walking into something he does not understand. His advisors like Larry Kudlow, not high on my list, do not understand. They're like these Republicans that are just supply side, cut taxes, you'll always grow. This is not true. There is a time to cut taxes and there's a time to raise it. This is more time to raise it because we can't seem to get out of deficits even in boom time. So I think what's going to happen is Donald Trump is setting up. Everybody thinks he's gone from wrecking ball to walking on water. Everybody thinks he's going to create 3 to 4% growth instead of 1 to 2%. And I say it's not going to happen. And I say within a year that this job growth is going to dry up and there's going to be no more of these unemployed people looking for jobs to hire back. And you're not going to be able to create jobs like we've been creating. And that's going to be an even bigger disappointment. So I say it ain't going to happen. And you can cut taxes all you want because look, the Fed is all, and central banks around the world have created free money. I don't mean just short term where people can borrow and traders at short term rates and leverage up, but where companies can borrow. It's zero adjusted for risk-free rates, lowest rates in history. And what have they done with that money? They didn't expand capacity substantially. What they did was buy back their stocks and engineer a lot of mergers and acquisitions, financial engineering, because we don't need a lot more capacity after the greatest bubble boom in history from 1983 to 2007, which demographics would have told you was coming and was going. We've been living off quantitative easing ever since. That had nothing to do with Obama, nothing. Presidents don't create that. The Federal Reserve and central banks, in this case, have a much bigger impact. And Obama had no way to turn around that economy that substantially. And Trump is not going to create 4% growth, period, from my point of view. Just not going to happen. And market's going to be disappointed probably later this year, a good bit later, when they realize that or when this jobs thing suddenly slows down for no apparent reason. It's just demographics.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. Boris, do you have any take on Trump, what he means for the near future?
Sorry, Ross, you faded a little bit. Can you just repeat your question for me again?
Sure. Yeah. Do you have any ideas, any thoughts on what Trump means for global markets in the near future?
So I'm going to make the opposite argument of Harry, although probably my conclusion is going to be very much the same. So I'm going to give you a Keynesian argument for why Trump could succeed wildly beyond our greatest imaginations and at the same time fail. And I fear that he probably is going to do the second, not the first part. I agree with Harry that sort of the pure tax stimulus. The problem. Let me rephrase this. I would disagree with the whole argument that we have a massive deflationary problem, that we have a huge bubble, that we created all this debt because, as a matter of fact, all of the debt we created is effectively owed to ourselves. I don't think we, our situation as far as debt services is unsustainable in any way, shape, or form. It's well within the norms of GDP. I think the single biggest problem with the U.S. economy is demand, distribution of income. We've simply had an incredible lumpy income where 1% of the people literally for the last 30 years literally took every dollar of profit from the economy to the 1% of the people. And the 99% of the people from which true demand comes, from which true growth comes, from which true growth in capitalism comes, have not had a penny wage hike. So one of the interesting things, and I actually said this the day that the day after the election on Squawk, and I thought Joe Kernan was going to pop a vessel when I said to him, one of the ironies of the whole thing is that if Trump thinks outside the box like he has been able to, and acts very much like the big deal FDR Democrat, he actually could create a massive, massive growth in this economy. One of the first things he could do that could be far more stimulatory than any tax cut he does is mandate federal minimum wage to $15 an hour, which would instantaneously create, and I see Joe having a heart attack here now, which would instantaneously create massive amount of spending and would get him to 3.5–4% growth target. Will he do this? I don't know. I don't think so. I think he's being swayed very much by the old guard right-wing methodology of just simply tax and cut, tax and cut, tax and cut, and benefit the 1% of the people without actually looking how to economically benefit the 99% of the people, which is where all the growth comes from. So I think he will fail, but probably for the wrong, for the different reasons than Harry thinks. But I do think that there is a chance for success. Now, the Trump trade itself, the basic Trump trade itself right now, across all capital markets, is very simple. The Trump trade right now is long U.S. equities, short bonds, and long U.S. dollar. And that whole Trump trade is predicated on very much what Harry was talking about, the idea that the markets think that he's walking on water, that he's going to infuse the economy with incredible amount of dynamism, that he's going to create corporate spending. The other issue, by the way, and in that sense, I do agree with Harry, the investment in capital spending on the corporate side, despite the fact that the money, one of the interesting things is that interest rate has if nothing else, quantitative easing has proved, I think, absolutely to a full extent, that it doesn't matter if interest rates are 100% or 0%. If there's no demand, nobody's going to borrow anything. So corporate spending has actually been very, very lackluster. Investment spending has been very lackluster over the last 5–6 years, even at zero interest rates. Most of the money that's been borrowed has been borrowed for financial engineering to simply buy back stock and reduce capital stock instead of actually buying it for a good, strong investment. If he focuses, and there are many people who I've seen make the argument that if he focuses on policies that help Main Street versus policies that help Wall Street, there is a surprising amount of growth that the U.S. economy could generate, and there is a surprising amount of power that the Trump trade could generate. We could see dollar yen 130. We definitely could. We could see, certainly the 3-year at, the 10-year above 3%. We could see the Dow, 22,000. All of that is possible in a year and a half going forward if he can maintain this momentum. But he really would have to be very unorthodox in his policies in order to accomplish that. So that's what I'll be watching over the next 6 months.
Okay, so long stocks, short bonds, and long the dollar. Joseph, so what was it there that you were challenging perhaps Boris on a little bit? Something to do with the minimum wage?
I would never challenge Boris. I like him too much. We're at an interesting place in first assessing, I think, Obama's presidency. It's very hard to take sort of the emotional, cultural aspect out of your judgment. Obama, whatever he does, has been criticized for not producing enough growth, for many things. But Harry's absolutely correct. What you need to look at is where the Obama administration places in long-term trends, demographic, more important probably than any other, that are driving the U.S. economy that an 8-term, or even a 3-year, 4-term president can have very little to affect. One of the charts I have up here, I'm not going to put it up because I'm sure you all know it, is personal income from 1980 until now. It has a nice slope left to right because it's been going down year to year. It's one of the things that's driving CPI down. It's not only that the central banks have been successful, and central bankers are bureaucrats. They have a tendency to aggregate all success credit to themselves when very often it's really not there. So those trends are part of the Obama inheritance and the Obama period. There's little that he could have done, I think, to change some of those trends. On the other hand, one thing we forget, and Boris is I think, right in a sense to focus on not so much demand, but on the ability to spend. Okay, and they're not quite the same thing. And Harry's also right that the bubbles of the past 2 or 3 decades have created an enormous amount of oversupply. There is a huge amount of pressure, deflationary, running through the world economy. You can look at it in what China has done. You can look at it in the development of resource extraction. You can look at it in the development of manufactured products. I know one time I was thinking that the people in the United States who take the inflation numbers decided at some point a number of years ago to incorporate the value of the supposed increased value of better products as part of the inflation. But what they didn't do is also incorporate the value of more shoddier products, which also affect the consumer. So you end up with an unreal number for inflation. But the idea that only income will provide it. If we just give people income, they'll spend it. But you have to take a step back. Businesses are the items, are the force that create jobs. And one of the things, and this is where the Obama administration, I do fault it, has been inhibitory, I think, for business creation, for business spending. And it's not only the administration, it is the Fed as well. I think there is one thing that's certainly true after this experiment, which I think is a failure with zero rates. Zero rates have a different impact. It's sort of like there's a quantum difference in interest rates when you get closer to the zero bound. The lineal relationship between a lower rate from 3 to 4 or from 2 to 3 or 3 to 2 is not the same as from 1 to 0. You no longer get the effect on the economy that you were predicting beforehand. So between some of the Obama administration's, if not anti-business, but just simply not paying attention to the idea that businesses are necessary to create jobs, and that's where the income comes from, and the effect of lower zero-bound interest rates on business, you have a whole sector of the economy that is necessary to create this, the virtuous cycle of job creation and business creation and spending that has been absent. How can you plan as a business if interest rates are at 1% or 0.5%, and at some point they're going to go up? Where do you spend your money? You don't. You go, and Harry's absolutely right. You take the extra money you can get and you go back and buy back stocks. You buy their companies. You don't invest because it's too difficult to predict what's going to happen in the future. So when Trump comes in, he can change some of these things, but not all of them. Mm-hmm. I am dubious that you're going to get 4% growth, but I think you might, for a few quarters, get 3% growth by unleashing some of the things that have been stymied as far as planning and spending on the business side goes. The American consumer seems willing to spend. We talk about job creation. Many of the jobs, I'm not sure what portion is, but it's close to 50% of jobs that have been created over the past 7 or 8 years have been either part-time or are jobs that are not the old full-time jobs. Even under different wage standards, they're still not providing the full dose of income. So jobs are created, but if you're not working full-time, if your hours are capped at 30%, you don't provide the same boost for the economy that you would as a full-time job. So for that aspect of it, I think Trump can improve some of these things, and we will get growth. But over time, the long-term trends of too much debt, of overproduction, will reassert themselves, and declining population. I mean, GDP is a function of the number of people working. And if that aspect is growing more slowly, you simply don't get the goods produced because there aren't that many people there to do it as much. So we're in a period, I think, where the world economy is shifting from what would have been the long play out after the Second World War to a different style of growth and a different amount of economic activity. Mr. Trump, as I said, can affect some of this, but not all of it.
Sure, and Harry, I mean, what happens to that narrative in a climate where, in fact, interest rates will be going up?
Well, I think that we predicted they'd go up this year just because the bond trade was overdone. And inflation is a lagging indicator, as are jobs, and not leading. And inflation tends to come in the early part of the next downturn or late stage. So we're getting all of that. Eventually, interest rates will go up. But I tell you, it's hard to communicate this because I studied demographics. I've studied so deep, so globally, so long. People don't get what's happening. This is the first time in the developed, wealthy world where the next generation, the millennials, in most countries, and only in a few otherwise, is substantially smaller or even almost non-existent in Southern and Central Europe and East Asia and Japan and these countries. And in the US, the millennials just bring us up to the same level of housing demand or car demand or total spending or peak anything. As the baby boom. This has never happened before. The baby boom was massively larger than the Bob Hope generation. And again, we're the best house in the bad neighborhood because we've had the least central bank stimulus compared to Europe and then Japan off the reservation. Our demographics are better than Europe and way better than Japan, but they're still sideways. The emerging world is the only place that has demographic growth, even when we come out of this excessive debt period and the decline. And baby boomers, people don't get. People trying to get people to spend more money. Old people who are becoming dominant for a while, not forever, till the millennials get stronger and bigger numbers and older and higher earning, because half of them aren't even in the workforce yet. The baby boom generation, old people don't spend more money on average. Old people don't get more productive. They don't get less. Old people buy all the real estate almost in their life between age 27 and 41. So how real estate will never be the same. In Japan, real estate collapsed over 60%, commercial 80%. 26 years later, it's never bounced because for every young person coming in wanting to buy a house, and there's fewer of them, an older person is dying. And what's an old person? A freaking seller. End of story. So people don't get, I mean, real estate is the prime thing when you have a smaller generation follow a larger one. And we've never seen this in modern history. We've never seen it, I don't know how far back you go. The world changes. And so we're never going to grow 4% again, period. That's my forecast. I am 100% serious about that. Never going to grow at 4% again. Workforce growth is going to be near zero. Population's growth, we calculate 0.27% for the next 4 to 5 decades. And I'm being a little generous on immigration because that's falling, and we're building a wall for nobody, by the way. Another big Trump mistake, if he gets away with it. And productivity, old people don't get more productive. They get less. I mean, in fact, they just stop working at some point and do nothing, and then they die. How do you create growth out of that?
Yeah.
This is a reality that's factual, easily projectable, and everybody is ignoring it. And I'm like saying, do it at your peril because, yeah, no way 4% growth. Yeah, maybe a few quarters. That's as long as I give it. I don't give Trump a year before he blows up myself because I think he's going to disappoint everybody. Not because he's not going to try, and he is going to do and can do some good things. I don't think it's going to make much difference.
I agree with Harry on this one thing. Old people are the single biggest problem in OECD world, period. Because old people consume welfare benefits, healthcare benefits, and do nothing. They are the single biggest welfare class in OECD world, the single greatest drag on everything that we do. And we all know this, and it's a very impolite thing to say because, you know, we don't want to be rude, but generally, basically, the single biggest leeches of society is anybody who is 75 years of age and older. What's even worse is most of their politics is geared towards getting them benefits and giving no benefits to the younger generation. So we are certainly in a very, very tough political situation because old people get all the money and pay nothing into society, into which they they're leaving to the young people who have to work twice as hard to take care of the generation. Having said this, though, there is a sort of a light at the end of the tunnel that all of us are ignoring, which is robotics and automation. I think we cannot underestimate the power of technology to overcome this demographic bulge. That, within maybe 5 or 10 years, we could have such massive improvements in robotics, in healthcare, in driving, and everything else, that the overall supply shift, using the old economics term, basically the supply curve is just simply going to go down. Everything is just going to be so much less expensive, and we're going to be able to get so many more products for the same amount of money, so that growth can be sustainable. The question in the meantime is Trump going to be able to juice up demand? And I really think it's exactly what it is. It's very much like a drug analogy. It's an unsustainable but very much necessary kind of a juice over the next 18 months to get the economy ramped up on enthusiasm. Because ultimately, the basic economic model in all capitalist societies is a complete model of self-confirming affirmations. Basically, I feel good, I spend money, the economy starts to grow. The economy starts to grow, I feel better. It's what's called the virtuous cycle. And conversely, I feel bad, I stop spending money, the economy starts to contract, I feel worse. So while we talk about numbers and while we talk about debt and everything else, the only real important thing, I think, as Trump understands, is feelings. And so far, he's got positive feelings on his side. And it's a question of how much he can exploit that for the next 18 months forward.
Sure, and any of these policies are going to take a long time to go through. I mean, there's a number of things that he can probably look to implement straight away, and I'm just wondering what are the most important things what are the things that you should be concentrating on there to create that to juice up the demand that you said there. I mean, the immigration is an issue. You've got the repeal and replace Obamacare, trade, and tax reforms. They're probably the 4 things that he can initiate right away. What would be the most crucial one out of those 4? Trade, the immigration, repeal and replace Obamacare.
Well, if you're looking, I mean, I would put them all in one category as far as the effects that you're going to have. Businesses have been sitting on a ton of money. They're not spending it. They're putting it into the stock market. They're not doing things with it that create jobs and they create jobs, but they create the kind of spending that will spread out through the economy. Now, they're not the largest part of the economy, of course, but they are the part which has been missing. And they're the part, I think, that Trump can most directly affect, because those things have regulatory issues. They have some of the impediments inherent in Obamacare as far as what businesses do. So that's one side, and that's something that can be done relatively easily. He's not going to have any problems with the Republicans on this. This is their brief back as far as Coolidge, so they're not going to have an issue with that. Whatever amount of deficit or stimulus spending, and I think it's going to be less than he has spoken about, that also will have the same type of effect, although that kind of deficit spending and that kind of stimulus is a very inefficient way of getting the economy to go. Nevertheless, something will happen. So those 2 things, just on the face of it, will give some sort of boost to the economy in the next year. Immigration, I'm not sure it has that much effect on the types of productivity issues that we're talking about. I mean, both sides, the Democrats and Republicans, for many years have said that immigration has no effect on wages here in the United States. I've never bought that argument. It always seems self-serving from both parties for different reasons. So we will see if that has any change. But I don't think it's a great effect. As far as trade goes, trade honestly is the thing that I worry. I know this gets the most coverage that Trump's going to create a trade war, but I think it's of least concern. The United States still is the world's largest and most lucrative market to sell to. Every successful exporter in the world, whatever percentage it is specifically of their exports, needs access to the U.S. market. That is a very large negotiating fact, and I don't think it's one that's going to be ignored. What we're talking about here with China and with other countries as well is a change in the terms of trade. You can make arguments that whatever you say about free trade ignores a large raft of socioeconomic factors within the country and certainly within the United States. That is one of the truths which propelled Trump to victory. That's why those states in the old industrial Northeast and middle of the country voted for Trump, even if it was a small factor that they did it. So changing the terms of trade is not a trade war. And it can be affected by the type of bully pulpit leadership that comes out of the White House. I mean, I've read a number of stories say, oh, the carrier deal is industrial policy. No, it's not. That's not industrial policy. It's browbeating people perhaps to do something, but it's not some sort of government industrial policy where you choose this industry to succeed and that industry not to succeed. And Boris is right. That was an emotional payback for Trump's voters. And he is very attuned to this as a politician. And whatever else one wants to say about Trump, he is the only one who caught this entire movement. Now, it was evident all around the world, and it is still, but he's the only one who caught it and wrote it. So I think we're going to get from Mr. Trump action, but it is going to be difficult to go against long-term the demographic and other trends. And one final point on this. The change in population and the population reproductive rates across the world is tied closely to success in the economy. Wealthier people have fewer kids. Okay, everybody knows that. On the other hand, it is also a cultural expression of a type that we're not sure of and can't quantify. But I think it's as possible, as Boris looks to robotics, I think it's quite possible that populations in various countries start having more children at some point so that the populations do not decline into permanent negativity, if you will. Now, Japan, which nobody pays much attention to, but is the primary forerunner of all of these things. If anybody wanted to know if zero interest rates are going to work, well, just go to Japan. I mean, but nobody does. Central banks lower interest rates because, why? Because central banks can. And that's pretty much the only thing they can do. So they do it. They're enjoined to act by their bureaucratic position. So if at some point you see the Japanese return to procreation, I haven't been to Japan, so I can't comment on it. And I'm married, so I can't comment on it otherwise. You will see something, I think, that is more hopeful for the world economy, because in truth, modern capitalism has never, I mean, post 1500, has never faced a declining population. It's easy to be successful in a capitalist system when there's more demand every year because there are more people. If there aren't, we have a different issue.
Right. Although I will tell you that I'll take the opposite side of Joe's bet, because
I'm shocked. Boris, I'm shocked.
As far as why population will never grow, it has to do with the fact that all three of us are men, and the decision on population is determined by women. As women
Absolutely.
gain more economic power and more economic cultural progress, their desire for children diminishes tremendously. And the notion that women are going to somehow radically change their demand for having more children is simply wishful thinking on our part. So no chance of that happening. And it's interesting. I mean, I think that that's a really interesting point that Joe raises, that and Harry raises. Can we, establish a post-modernist capitalist society where you have a declining population and growth? It's never been done. It is truly going to be a challenge for us as we go forward. There's going to be a tremendous amount of substitution, definitely robotic substitution, definitely all sorts of other stuff. My view, which is much more leftward than anybody else's, is that I think we're essentially outsourcing ourselves out of the capitalist business. 90% of our jobs, including our own here, as talking heads, we're pretty much going to be unnecessary in 10 years through artificial intelligence. And unless we really begin to understand that universal basic income and that all sorts of things that are incredibly socialist and utopic in our view are going to be necessary to provide some kind of a continuous welfare care for society, it's going to be very hard to imagine a world where We cannot compete. It's not that we should be able to compete. It doesn't matter how smart we are. We'll never be able to compete against the computer. The biggest example of that, of course, is in our own business in finance, where over the last 7 years, we've literally seen the whole business completely hollowed out. There literally is no trading business anymore. It's all done by 3 guys with PhDs versus thousands and thousands and thousands of dealers. And Joe, being a former dealer himself, could agree. So I think those are very interesting societal questions that are hurling at us at the speed of a meteor, and we're probably not even looking at them as carefully as we should.
Hey, real quick, let me chime in. Japan, everybody should be studying Japan. Japan was the first baby boom to peak demographically, was the first bubbles, massive bubbles in real estate and stocks that peak and crash and never come back to those heights 26 years later. So they show you what aging does. And I mean, I'm seeing article after article in the last few years. Younger Japanese workers did get screwed. The older people, like Boris said, and Joe, took all the benefits. The young people don't have any anymore. Their jobs are not as good. They're more part-time. Young Japanese do not want to even date, nevertheless get married and have a damn kid because they cannot afford to.
Right.
From economy. So they're not procreating more. There's a big...
But here, can I ask you a question? Can I ask you a question? The biggest issue with Japan, aside from, of course, the worst bubble ever, is that they never took care of it. They basically never recognized their losses.
Exactly, and we have neither. We've never written down all the bad loans.
But we've written down more than they have, haven't we? I mean, we've been able to kind of, bankrupt and destroy more lives than they have, and maybe in the short term that was painful, but long term it was better. I mean, I think the problem with Japan, why zero interest rate policy in Japan has never worked, is because they simply have ghost zombie banks still operating.
Right. And they have empty homes, and China has more empty homes. And there's 8 million empty homes because old people keep dying, and there's not enough young people to buy those homes. Real estate will never be the same again. Never will come back to the heights in Japan. How does an economy grow without real estate? Is the most leveraged part of the economy. If people aren't buying homes, or there's more old people dying than young people buying, how are you going to grow out of that? So Japan is a great example. And I see another thing happening. I have a longer term cycle that's very bullish, a 500-year cycle that suggests population growth again and inflation and things like we've seen in the past, not near term. And I think the way I think it's going to happen, first of all, the emerging world may have a second baby boom, and they're the ones driving demographics. But more important, I think the developed world is going to have an aging revolution. It just ain't going to happen overnight. It ain't going to happen near enough to save Trump. I can guarantee you that. In fact, I have a technology cycle. I got a lot of cycles, but 2032 to 2035, 55 would be the next, robotics, biotech, nanotech, this stuff. I mean, this stuff's all around now, but it's not mainstream, especially nanotech, which I think is the most powerful. So I think you can get to the point where people are living to 100 to 120. Now they enter the workforce in their early 20s like they do now, but they don't retire till they're 90 or 100 and then only retire for 10 or 15 years. And so they earn much more, contribute much more. Learning is exponential. The longer people live, one of the biggest reasons we had such an explosion in income and wealth, other than the size of the baby boom, was the fact that people started living longer dramatically in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And it's another reason we got this old person problem Boris is talking about, because people are living now into their 80s and 90s, and we're still acting like they're going to die at 70.
Right.
Because we didn't raise entitlements in line with life expectancies, which have gone up 10 years in just the last several decades. It could go up much more. So I think at some point when older people start living long, I mean, let's be as absurd to say, okay, you have a round of kids in your 20s, like most people now do, or early 30s. And then when they're rose and stuff, and you're living and you got Viagra and all these new drugs and stuff, and so you have a second round in your 60s. And you screw up on your first kids, and the second group turns out perfect. And people, things like this can happen. But the main thing right now, here's demographics, and this is hard, cold facts for the average person. Enter the workforce at 20. retire at 63. That's 43 years in the workforce. And then they live, if they live to 63, they're going to make it to 85 and average. Then they retire for 22, 23 years and do nothing. That is totally unsustainable. We didn't have entitlements before the late 30s and since. We've never had free health care for old people stuff. Like you said, Boris said, these people are not only consuming most the government spending, which has now become automatic, at the same time in the consumer world, they spend less on everything but health care. They downsize housing. An old person drives a car 3,000 miles a year, and then so they buy that Lexus and it lasts them for 12 years. Soccer mom goes through it in a car in 4 years, carting the kids around and stuff. So everything changes with this. So it's going to be something more radical. But my longer term cycles say, look, things are difficult for the next, say, 6, 7, 8 years. But we should come out of this globally, demographically, more emerging world. But at some point, the only way I can reconcile this 500-year cycle, which is a damn good cycle, being positive again with population growth and all stuff, would be that we start living a lot longer, like 20, 30 years longer. That would make a huge impact, more than young people having a little more sex and a few more kids. Here's the problem. You have a kid today. When do they enter the workforce? 20 years after or later. So having kids is a slow, very long impact for turning around demographics. Immigration is short term. I like immigrants because they're young. The typical immigrant's 23 years old, already educated, lower high, ready to work, doesn't cost money to raise. And I tell people, if you don't like immigrants coming to our country, they're going to compete with your wages if they can do it cheaper in Mexico or China. So wouldn't you rather than be here, spending money and paying some taxes here? So I'm pro-immigration. I just know the country's anti-immigration. Trump's anti-immigration. I think trade wars. I put out a graph recently that even blew my mind. I looked at globalization as a percentage of, global trade as a percentage of total GDP back to the 1700s. And globalization took off in the second half of the 1800s with the steamships and the railroads. It greatly expanded the capacity for trade. Then guess what? We went 33 years backwards. We went from 40% down to 12 between World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II. And in the Great Depression, in times like that, everybody gets what? Anti-trade. Produce it here, put up tariffs and stuff. And that's what Trump's doing. I'm seeing another peak, World War II, 1946, up until recently. Another massive, bigger surge in global trade and globalization. I think it's over. I think Trump, he's not going to create it by himself. I think he's a sign around the world with Brexit and everything else that the trade is going to contract. And that can seem like a win for certain countries, but in the end, it's a lose-lose. Less trade. If all countries start producing everything themselves, no, everybody's not good at everything, including the damn Chinese. They're bad at a lot of stuff. And it's not going to be good for the global economy. So that's a trend that I think is not a good trend. And I don't think that's going to go away. I don't think this is just should be a couple years, duking it out with China and Mexico. I think the whole world is leaning in the direction that Trump's thinking. And it's a natural cycle. And I don't mind cycles. Things go up, generations spin, then they don't. Technologies move mainstream like autos and electricity, then they don't. Internet, we've seen recently. I don't see technologies that are going to outdo the internet and Google and email. Facebook to me is dancing dogs and cats. I could give a crap about Facebook. It's entertaining. It's doing well. Didn't change my business like Google and email did. My research business has to have tripled in productivity from those two innovations. So technology goes. I've got a 45-year cycle in that. That cycle's pointing down for a good ways. I don't see this longevity revolution or these other robotics. I mean, where are the robots going to spend their money when they take over? Okay, Boris, where are they going to spend their money? They're going to go to the bar?
Wait. There is a possibility here.
The Japanese will be the first ones to have these robots because there aren't going to be any young people to change the bedpans.
Well, listen, if we look for technology 100 years out, I have twin girls there. We've been watching the old Star Trek stuff. I think I've got them hooked. One of the things that is certainly possible within 100 years is the type of expansion in both population and productivity needs from colonization of space. it is something that I've hold dear to my heart as an old science fiction fan, but it is certainly within the realm of technology. At the moment, it's not in the realm of budgetary of spending. Nobody wants to spend the money on it. But I firmly believe,
and it couldn't be mass market anytime soon. That's the
no,
thing.
it could not. It could not. You're talking about
everybody instead of the few.
I agree. This is not going to rescue Trump, but you're talking at some point about 500-year cycles. I think this is something for humanity, which will change things and will promote the type of expansion in economies and populations that we'll see. But, talking about Japan,
real quick, let me just say, technology, as far back as you want to measure anything, even evolution, it's all exponential. People think linearly. So like you say, if you go 50 years now, people are going to be shocked. Nobody's going to predict what's going to happen. Nobody would have thought people have been flying around the world in the early 1900s and going to vacations in Tahiti for $299. Nobody would have thought that. Or everybody would have 2 cars and stuff. So you're right. I mean, that's where these longer term cycles come in. We're in a demographic slump. I think we're even in a technological slump. We're saturated with the internet to the point that people are screwing around on Facebook. That's all they can think to do at this point. And
I think some of the
technologies will expand. That's the one thing you can bet on.
I mean, listen, I've been a fan of science fiction since I was a kid, so this is a natural for me. But when you look at where the push goes, it's not going to come from governments. And one of the things that I very much support Obama in doing has been shifting the emphasis on space exploration and space commercialization to the private sector, which is where it belongs. That has been a very good thing, and it will go because the vision must be to Mars. It's not that hard now. So all of these things are very, touchy-feely. They're not particularly concrete. But for the expansion of the race, I think that's true. However, all of the trends we've been talking about, and one of the things that it's very difficult to get away from, and you just mentioned, Harry, is the idea of linear projection. We all do it. It's what we know. Everybody does it. And that exactly is what the Fed did with lowering interest rates. Well, quantum mechanics tells you that isn't necessarily true. So I think that's also true in some of the cycles that we're seeing here. It becomes very, very difficult as an economist or a statistician to put something in your equations, and I am not either one, where it says, well, this is where we get the boom from because we can't envision it. So I'm not as unhopeful about the future. For the immediate 5 or 6 or 10 years, I would say yes, it looks a little difficult because there's simply not the trends in place to change. But yet I think something will. Boris, I'm trying to be optimistic.
No, I hear. How about, can I bring the discussion to a much shorter time frame and play a little bit of a devil's advocate?
Sure.
What if we've seen the worst of all these horrible trends? What if Brexit doesn't really happen? What if the UK Supreme Court, which is going to rule on January 24th, tells them Parliament has to vote in order to approve Brexit? And that puts the complete brakes into Theresa May's colossal, no clue what she's doing plans, and the pressure on Parliament to actually act in the interest of the state rather than emotion, creates a much more collaborative environment. Preserves London's place as a center of finance in the world, and creates some sort of a compromise within the EU, keeps them in place. What if populism sort of peaks? What if Trump, for all of his bravado talk about trade, is really only trying to essentially massage the deals at the edges? That he's not. You think he's trying to do that, right? Is that what you're saying?
I think I agree with that. I think he's simply trying to change the term of trade.
The guy is a deal maker, not a deal breaker. I think he wants to deal with Canada. He wants to deal with Mexico, and a lot of these. Also, I will say this interesting thing. One of the things that Trump really knows how to do, unfortunately, like a good bully, is he really knows how to stick the knife into the guy who's on the floor writhing in pain. Like, he really knows how to increase pain. The Chinese right now are in bad pain. And Trump is actually in a much stronger position to negotiate with Chinese than we've had in years. So in some ways, what if a lot of these things don't turn out as bad. I mean, it's far from me to be a Pollyanna, because God knows I'm a sour, skeptical Russian. But I think in some ways, maybe a lot of these things have sort of peaked in the near term, and maybe things are not going to be as bad as we think they are. There's not going to be a trade war. Britain is not going to spin out of EU, and a lot of these populist forces may be able to dissipate a little bit, and we could have, let's say, favorable 12 to 24 months worth of activity that should maintain the Trump trade in the direction that we talked about, at least for the near term.
Boris, I don't have nearly your negative view of Brexit. I don't think, first of all, I think that it's in such the better interests of both the EU and Britain, both for trade reasons and on the EU side for political reasons, that they come to a reasonable agreement on this, that I don't think it's going to be all that bad. I think it probably will end up benefiting Britain in the long run. I don't think that anyone is going to up and leave Britain's London's financial system for what? To put their banks and their deals under the regulatory sway of Brussels? That makes no sense at all. So I don't think it's going to be nearly as bad. The other thing that is a huge problem is that, all know the Churchill quote, democracy is the worst of all systems except for all others. You all know that quote. Well, that's the problem with saying the interests of the state against the interests of the people. Whatever you want to say about who voted for Brexit, it was a legit vote. And it's a vote which needs to be carried through, because if you take
I'll argue with that. First of all, it was just a referendum. It was a non-binding vote made by people who are not productive people in London. Again, made by people who do not contribute to the economy. The people who contribute to the economy, all the people who are actually responsible for all the growth in the UK, voted to remain because they understand the value of free movement of human beings and goods.
But Boris,
so as always, you have the least productive people making the worst economic policy for the rest, and that's why Brexit is actually a terrible
That's
vote.
the basis of democracy.
Right. I understand.
Everybody gets to vote regardless of how productive they are and how much they contribute.
Correct. But if we're arguing about policy and about intent, the intent here, when I say the interest of the state, I truly mean it is in the best interest of the state for UK to remain within a single market. And I've actually spoken to a lot of bankers and a lot of compliance people who are right now in the midst of moving everybody out. They're talking Ireland. They're talking. They're trying to figure out maybe Frankfurt. There's going to be a huge exodus because the rules are going to say capital cannot be in UK, and if capital is not in UK, there is nothing else in UK. UK produces nothing else except finance. They produce terrible jam and really, really bad cars. They couldn't sell.
No, come on. Aston Martin's a great car. I mean, not that I have one.
Overpriced, we're talking about here, guys.
So I guess my optimistic view is that they will remain somehow. There's going to be some give and take. We'll see. I think that's fascinating. I think that's going to be an incredibly interesting story for all of us in the markets to follow, because that's going to be, just like Japan was the story before. UK is sort of the front line of populism versus globalism in how that place is going to resolve in the grander scheme of history. That's going to be fascinating to watch.
It's great.
One quick prediction. I'm going to end with this. Germany has the worst demographics, even worse than Japan I saw in the late 80s, early 90s. Yeah. Worst demographics in the next several years, next decade, than any developed country in the world. And people think Germany's going to hold the EU and the Euro together. I think the UK is going to be rewarded for Brexit. And I think whatever short-term stints in banking and finance, they're going to be the only place left. Because I think that the demographic and the debt problems are the worst in Southern Europe and Central Europe, which includes Germany and Austria. Not Switzerland, but Germany and Austria. So Germany, I think, is going to be a huge disappointment and wake-up call in the next few years. Nobody saw Japan going down. And who depends on global trade more than Germany? Germany depends on global trade way more than China does, 50% of their GDP. So we do have this kind of Trump Brexit or contraction of trade. How are they going to grow? They have the worst demographics.
Germany. You better take control, Ross.
I just want to let you roll all day long, but unfortunately, I think, Boris, you're short for time. I just want to bring it back slightly to the foreign exchange market. So, I mean, Trump is actually in favor of a Brexit. So, Boris, what would be your trade? I mean, I don't know what your trading style is. I presume it's sort of longer term under the sort of the asset management.
Yeah, it's the exact opposite.
Right.
I'm a very short-term trader, but go ahead. Your question.
So my question would be then, what would be your trade then? What are your are you long sterling, for instance?
No.
The Brexit.
I think sterling. I'm a believer that Brexit is not good for UK, and in the place where it's the least good is on the currency side, where UK, which depends on massively on infusion of capital because it runs a huge capital account deficit continuously. If it sees exit of capital for whatever reasons, if just Germans just basically say, screw it, we don't want anybody doing business in UK if they're going to leave, there is a reasonable case to be made 110 and an extreme case of parity, pound to the dollar long term. Now, I'm a guy who trades on a 5-minute chart, so I'm the last person to ask for long-term strategic trades. But my view is that if we go hard Brexit, and because it is very much in Germans' interest not to negotiate with the Brits, because as somebody said, if they do, everybody else is going to want to spin out. Germany has a huge advantage by having the euro, and therefore co-opting, and Joe agrees with this, of course, we all notice that they basically co-opt all of Europe. They own all of Europe because they have the euro. If the euro spins out and they have to go to the Deutschmark, they're dead. They are dead because the Deutschmark goes to 3 to whatever the hell the other currency is, and they will be completely uncompetitive in the world. So I think they're going to work very, very hard to punish anybody who wants to exit the union, because they know the end game is that they could either they lose or the Brits lose. It's not a question of both people winning.
But the problem with the Germans punishing Britain is that Germany's history, as we all know, in Europe is not a pleasant one. And the more you punish, the more resentment you build across in places like Italy and Spain, where you have 50% youth unemployment. The cultural factors will be exacerbated against Germany, which would be against the EU, by this type of what will be seen as heavy-handed enforcement. The Greeks don't like the Germans at all. I go to Italy all the time. So I mean, it's a big risk.
I totally agree with you. Yet, everybody votes, even the Greeks voted to stay in the euro because they know the moment they spin out, whatever new currency they have isn't going to be worth the toilet paper that they're using. Their wealth will literally go down to like 50%. And while people hate the Germans, they want to preserve their wealth. And that's, I think, the bargaining chip that the Germans have.
Yeah, for Greece, I agree. For Italy and Spain, I'd say it's far less so. Those are far more established economies.
But I think the Spaniards are far less interested in going back to the peseta. I think the Spaniards of all of them have actually recovered the best. I go to Spain every year. I see how incredibly well and dynamic that economy has become. And I think there's going to be a lot of institutional resistance to get to leaving the Eurozone there.
Spain has the best demographics. Nobody's aware of that. Spain is the best demographics. That's why they recovered the best.
Is there
a lot of young people?
Is there a way of coming out of the euro? I mean, Le Pen was saying we've got the French elections coming up as the next major risk, bar a banking crisis in Europe. And Le Pen was talking about a peg, was she not? A French franc peg to the euro. Didn't got any ideas on that?
I mean, pegs never work. So, I mean, she can say one. And it's a way to sort of assuage the worries about leaving and going against the EU, but currency pegs never work except for a short amount of time, so they won't work here.
Ross, back to that very important question of elections. This is a critical thing. This is where either I'm wrong and populism really takes full force, or it has peaked and they all fail. If Le Pen fails, if the Germans fail, if the Austrians fail, if Merkel maintains her position, then that whole peak of populism fails, and we're back to breathing easily. If they don't, yes, we have a whole new ball game, and the world is going to be a much darker place. So
I mean, the Dutch are the first election. The Dutch are in March.
Right.
And Wilders is leading, but the other parties say that they will not form a coalition with him. There is an issue here which is more cultural than anything else, and that is kind of what is the largest unity, political unity, that people tend to have, that people have feel an allegiance to. Imperial powers, which is what the EU essentially is in its demanding loyalties, tend not to work unless they're enforced by military strictures. True of the Russians. The only one that's ever really succeeded, the United States, and that's an entirely different story because it is unlike the development of countries everywhere around the world. So this is an issue which I think we can't address here because it's, I don't know anybody can, but it's not part of our brief here. But it is not, I think, simply populism as expressed as some sort of retrograde assertion of older people. There's more to it than that when you are talking about gathering the loyalties of a population.
Yes. Joe makes a great point, probably the best, most intelligent point on sort of the other side of the issue, which is that
why we love each other.
Everybody hates empires. And that's true. That's Europe's greatest weakness, right, is it's acting like an empire, not as a sort of a collaborative state. You know?
Right. It's a big problem.
Well, I mean, that's why I think, Boris, that, I mean, some of the stuff you were saying there about Brexit, I mean, I wouldn't agree with. You know, I think it was very much an anti-establishment vote. You know, there are many successful people in Britain that are working with good jobs in whatever sector that voted to leave on that very notion.
No, first of all, guys, first of all, let's be real. It was a 51-48 vote. We're hardly talking about a massive populist movement to one way. Similarly with Trump, it was actually the other way around. There are more people in America that are far more globalist and humanist than they are populist. It's just simply because of the electoral college that he won. So let's not corrupt the results by extrapolating them into I think a far more unrealistic idea of who voted for what. But the forces that these things tapped are very much real, and I think Joe very much pointed them out. That yes, there is even people who, let's say, voted against their own self-interest, did so because they hate the empire. The empire strikes back, right? And I think, those forces, but again, those are emotional issues and political issues, not economic ones. And that's
voting, as we all know, is an emotional event.
No, correct.
More than anything else.
Yeah.
That's kind of who we are, you know. Go to any old Star Trek episode, hey, bring it back. Kirk gets split into two people. One is emotional, one is logical. Doesn't work. So the system, you're absolutely right that it was a close vote. But the only way we have of dividing these things without wars is the system we use. And it's certainly the best. So you have to bend over backwards, I think, to accept the results of the system the way it decides, simply because all other alternatives are much, much worse.
Totally agreed. So guys,
I think all of this stuff can be solved by 3% GDP growth. In other words, all of this populism, you know, money will pay for a lot of sins. Unfortunately, as Harry says, there is no way we're going to be able to make that kind of money. But if we can make cheddar, if somehow, you know, we all just do massive fiscal stimulus and suddenly EC and US runs at 3% GDP, a lot of these gripes will go away. You know?
Yeah, but if that happens, Trump's going to get reelected.
Yes, there's, you know, he's been sold short at every step of the way by people like me continuously.
Yes,
and I have finally learned one thing: don't underestimate him. Don't underestimate him. Don't fight the trend. I'm not selling the market short as it goes up against me continuously because I don't want to get margined out.
You guys are missing Japan again. Japan is now up to 95% of their GDP in cumulative quantitative easing versus 24% in the US and 36% in Europe, and they can't even grow 1% sustainably. So it's not going to happen. Not going to see 3% long term. And if it does, I'm going to be a limo driver in Australia. I would just be dead wrong about everything.
You're saying your numbers are that QE is responsible for the size of QE in Japan is 95% of its GDP? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, free money helps. Free money allows people to make money. Investment, the stock market to go higher than it was, real estate to be higher than it would be, mortgage loans to be much cheaper. Traders can borrow in Japan at nothing and leverage up 20, 30 times. Free money does, like a drug, does create additional financial performance. So does extra debt. And the major part of the debt, Boris, is in the private sector, not in government. People are missing that too. It's the private sector that's going to deleverage, and the private sector to call the Great Depression, not the public sector debt. That comes later. So these things that you guys said before, Japan never dealt with its debt or its excess capacity or anything. We haven't either. Not as bad as Japan. And China is the biggest bubble to burst I've ever seen in modern history. And I think somebody said before, China is vulnerable. Their economy is way more fragile than ours. We are still the best house in a bad neighborhood compared to Europe, Japan, and China is the worst. They just haven't had their trigger yet that kicks their ass. When it does, they're going to fall over like an elephant. That's my
This is Joseph. Let me ask you a question. This analysis, which I largely agree with, has been carrying on for 20 years now, and it keeps going. There is, or should be, a trigger where the assumptions behind the Japanese economy collapse, and where you get the types of problems that lead to all sorts of terrible things.
They bought all their bonds. How are you going to have a crisis when they issue record amounts of debt, far more than any other major country in the world, and then they buy all their own bonds?
They buy their own bonds, of course.
That's cheating. To me, what they've got is a coma economy. They'll never get to what I call the spring season from winter because they never dealt with winter. But, a doctor can keep you in a coma for a long time. I think the quantitative easing has just barely kept Japan alive. It has allowed their banks not to have to write down their debt. It's when they write down the debt where you get that deleveraging and get deflation and a depression effect. Quantitative easing has had one sole purpose. It makes life a little easier for an aging society, but mostly the banks don't have to write down all their zombie debts. And the government doesn't have to pay any interest on their massive debt because their interest rates are near zero. So it's cheating, and it can't work long term. But yeah, that's why they haven't had a major trigger there.
So what is Trump's policy on all of this? What's his outlook on QE? Is that something do you think that's going to come back into play? We're going to have interest rate rises and everything's going to hit the fan, and then we're going back to QE4?
I don't see
QE4. The Fed, central bank's going to have lost all credibility from my point of view, because everyday people are not that stupid. They know they're getting something for nothing here, and then if the governments just keep printing money and throwing in the banks and throwing the system and free money and low interest rate, but as long as it seems to work, I think if we see another failure because Europe blows up or China, those are my two big triggers. I don't think it's going to come as much from the U.S., except maybe a sudden slowdown in our jobs. But I think it's going to be Southern Europe, Germany, and or China down the road a little farther. Those things blow up. All it took was a subprime crisis in 4 states in the U.S. to trigger a global crisis. Why? Demographic trends were weak. Debt was at unprecedented levels, in Boris, more in the private sectors than in the government sectors. And so that's all it takes. All it takes is a trigger, and it's not going to come from Japan because they've been living on morphine forever. It's probably not going to come from the U.S. because we're the best house in a bad neighborhood. I think it's going to come from Germany, Southern Europe, and if China doesn't blow, I am going to quit my profession. If it doesn't blow sometime in the next few years, it's the biggest. I've never seen a bubble to compare with the crock of shit over there. It's unbelievable.
So I have, this has been a argument that people have been making since 2010, right?
Yeah.
And it just hasn't. And they slow and they restart. They slow and restart. And I think maybe what we're underestimating is just still the incredible surge of wealth being built. China now is the largest car market, the largest movie market in the world, the largest excess market in the world. All the growth in cars last year came from China. And until those trends kind of exhaust themselves, just because, they pretty much everybody who's middle income in China has gotten everything they've gotten, maybe there's more juice to go. I don't disagree that long term this is definitely a problem. I just think that it may be premature to call a funeral just yet.
Long term, the growth is in the emerging world. It's the developed world that does not have growth demographically. China has seen its workforce growth already peak in 2011. Another important point happened in 2015 that nobody noticed except for Kyle Bass. These rural migrants that run in, and they're not legal, into these urban areas and take the worst jobs and stuff. they, for the first time, started going back to the rice paddies because real estate is so damn expensive, pollution is choking, and they're treated like second-class citizens as if they were illegal Mexican immigrants in the United States. So they're going back. So how's China going to keep building empty condos and infrastructures for nobody now that it's not even in the future? The rural migrants have stopped for now. I think that's the death blow for China. As long as these rural migrants kept running in, they could keep building stuff for nobody and say, well, one day we'll need it.
So I think our central disagreement is that your basic premise is that all growth comes from human population. And most
of it comes from technological innovation, which also comes from cycles in human population.
Right. So my argument is that the technical innovation can be separated from human population. That the amount of innovation that's happening in China right now, the amount of technology that's sort of flowing through their society is making everybody there marginally more richer every year.
Stuff we've done. They're not creating breakthrough new stuff.
No, but what they are doing though is they are spreading a degree of wealth and consumption by creating wealth to much greater numbers.
Bidding up real estate around the world in English-speaking countries, creating bubbles that are going to burst like the Japanese did in the late '80s. And what happens when it bursts? All this is true.
I mean, both things.
Real estate markets. Mark my words on this. This is how bubbles form. From people like the Chinese, the wealthiest Chinese are moving their money out of the country at the speed of light because they don't trust their own bubble system or government.
That's definitely true. We've discussed it here.
Or me in Australia as a limo driver at the Gold Coast. China's going to blow in the next 6 years. I'm out of here.
You'll be out of business because Uber will be driving self-driving cars in the Gold Coast.
You know, one thing that I think that is true, which we've sort of skated over, is that the general world confidence, both economic and business-wise, I think, is far more fragile than you see day to day. You see, you know, ISM goes this, ISM goes up, best thing. But in general, it would not take much to bring the level of concern and the level of volatility much, much higher than it is now. The idea that, you know, the VIX is where it is for the past number of years is kind of silly. I mean, I understand why it's there. It's there because it's a trading vehicle.
That is a trade.
Right, not because it reflects anything.
Right, if you're going to ask me to back up the truck and take one massive speculative bet,
it would be the VIX?
Be the VIX. Yeah, I'd like to be long the VIX. I think that is a clear bubble ready to burst.
Yeah, and I think all of the things that Harry talks about are true, and that the penchant for governments and central banks to do as much as they can to continue along is a natural human tendency, certainly a natural tendency of human organizations, human bureaucracies. But it will not avail long-term against the trends, and I agree with that. So I would be long the VIX.
Yeah, real quickly, people always say, you know, all this quantitative easing, all the gold bugs, I've argued with them more than anybody. They've been dead wrong about gold and inflation and everything. The consequences of endless quantitative easing is not inflation because it's just fighting deflation. The consequences create greater bubbles than before in real estate and stocks, and bubbles only do one thing in history, one thing only. I don't even have one exception because people say, well, what if that? I said, no, I don't even have an exception. All bubbles burst, and this bubble's now gone crazy, and the real estate bubble in China is beyond crazy.
And Trump is aware of this, and what's he going to do about it?
And he's aware of it. He said we got a bad bubble, but somehow he's going to wave a magic wand and we're going to walk through this bubble without deleveraging it. Good luck, Donald, is my point of view on that.
I mean, I don't know if there's anything. There's not much he could. There's not a whole lot he could do about it anyway, to tell you the truth.
No, the central banks created this bubble, not him.
I think you guys are under the illusion that he's really interested in doing anything. He's just interested in bullying people around. He just, you know, he just wants, like if he gets the Chinese to kind of, you know, change their trade of terms, he considered it to be a win, irrespective of whether that's going to be long-term positive or long-term neutral to us. All of it is optics. None of it is performance. I mean,
but what if Trump is the guy that pricks the China bubble by? I think China will have to bend. I mean, they will have to give in. But what if that slows their GDP from 6% to 4%? I think it's 4% already. But let's just say it's that enough with China's debt and real estate valuations could prick their bubble, and Donald might renegotiate trade favorable for us. Next thing you know, China blows up and we're in a world depression.
It certainly would be a great time to sell the Aussie dollar. Definitely.
Yeah.
Which is another.
And buy the VIX, Boris. You should back up that truck.
Right. That is one thing. I mean, it's a kind of a trade where you could lose 2, 3, 4, 5 months in a row. But I do think this is one of the. I'm not a big lover of Nassim Taleb, but this is one of those situations where buying lottery tickets, I think, is a great structure at this point, because I do think even on a short-term basis, volatility is going to come back. Volatility is one of the most mean reverting aspects of the financial markets, and we are in a much more complacent state than we should be.
I agree with that completely.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, just this last month, I mean, it's been a roller coaster. It's been changing like the wind. You're going one way because that's where the market thinks it's going, and you're wrong-footed, or it's buying the fact, buying and selling. It's I mean, look, guys, I think we could go on all day with this. It's been extremely interesting. I've been taking notes. We've got some really, really good ideas coming out of this. Just a quick summary then. So what is, Boris, what's your view then? You're bullish in the near term, and you're long dollar, long stocks, and short bonds.
Yes. So basically, the assumption is the Trump trade continues until something subverts it, right? And what I would consider a subversion would be what maybe Harry was talking about, is if Trump sort of gets into the office and he gets challenged by either the Chinese or the Middle East or something else that sort of challenges his mettle, and he's really unable to respond, or he overreacts, he responds too strongly to some kind of a challenge that then creates all sorts of uncertainty in the marketplace. That could create a pall on all financial assets. I've been arguing for a very long time that if Trump focuses only on economic issues and just tries to create his stimulative agenda for the first 6 months of the year, the Trump trade really rolls along, irrespective of whatever else is going on. If he gets sidetracked by social issues, by political issues, by terrorism, by a million other things, and he takes his eye off the ball, which is the old Bill Clinton. It's the economy. It's actually, I forget who's Jim Carville said that. It's the economy, stupid. I mean, he got elected on this only thing that mattered, which is the economy, stupid. If he gets off that topic, then we're in trouble. So that's what I'm watching very carefully. I want the first 100 days, and believe me, the single biggest enemy of Trump is all the Republicans in the House of Representatives, who the last thing they want is all of these stimulative programs, all of this new issues that that's going on. They basically are complete slaves to their owner class of donors, and would just simply want to preserve yield and things as is. So to me, the most fascinating thing is going to be who's going to win, Trump or Paul Ryan, and that's going to determine, I think, a lot of how we go forward.
Joseph, what are your views then?
As far as the trade goes, I would largely agree with Boris's Trump trade. The only thing I would say that for the second half of the year, I would be long sterling. I do think that once the elections in Netherlands and France are out of the way, and whatever the Italians are going to do, they may have an election this year, I think it will become increasingly clear that this is, and Boris and I disagree on this, that the British Brexit trade will benefit both the economy and sterling. For Trump's sojourn in the White House, I also agree with Boris. His analysis is very accurate on this because I know Boris trades every day, that if he focuses on the economy, then he will get stuff done and you will see a boost in growth. However, the world is absolutely not going to let that happen. The Chinese are aware of this. The Russians are aware of this. It is the nature of a international political system like this to test someone like this. And it is going to happen. So I am, again, much as it surprises me to say this, with Boris on this, that it is going to be the difficulty and the unpredictability of Trump's response. It's easy for Trump to overreact when he's talking about some domestic political cultural dispute. nobody cares. It doesn't affect anything. It is absolutely not the case when there are substantive decisions based on this type of analysis. So that is my greatest concern, but it's not my greatest trading concern because all of that stuff will be good for trading.
That's true.
Okay. And Harry, in a snapshot on Trump this year?
I think there's a good chance he doesn't last the year for a number of reasons. I'm not going to get into some of them. I think the Trump rally does last probably till at least the summer, at least another 10% in stocks. Then I'm going to be telling people right now, we are short gold, short bonds, long stocks, long dollar. And at that point, I'm going to say this is the time to make a big switch, risk off, and go back into high quality treasury bonds, which I'm hoping the 10-year could be 3% by then, and out of stocks. And I would particularly want to short the small caps. Have had the most irrational move here on Trump. They tend to lead on the way down. They did last time. In fact, I'm going to be looking for divergences between the small caps and the large caps as this Trump rally goes along. And if I see that, I'm going to start getting very bearish. So I think huge short on stocks coming up. I think stocks could go down 70 to 80% in the next 2.5 years. And I think bonds, like they did in the 1930s, bonds like deflation and deleveraging, rates could go up to 3% on the 10-year and back down to 1% or a good bit lower. So you're getting a better than dividend yield, and you're getting a bond that appreciates in value, just like in the 1930s. The AAA corporates and the long-term treasuries doubled in value in the 1930s, where bubbles burst, stocks, commodities, real estate all got crashed, and nothing came back to where they were except for a few things. So I'm going to get very bearish if this. I think this is the final rally because it's the most irrational. It's Trump walking on water. I don't think he's going to be able to walk on water. That's my view.
So short on gold, where do you think, or when do you think the turning point would be for gold, Harry?
Well, commodities have led, and commodities have already done what I predicted years ago. When bubbles burst, they don't go down 30, 40, 50. They don't go down slowly. Oil went down, 80% in 4.5 months. This is what bubbles do. But commodities have already largely burst. Gold has been the laggard, and I think gold erases its bubble around 400 and retests its long-term lows at 250. Somewhere in there, I would bring up the truck and buy gold, because in the next global boom, it's going to be emerging countries dominant. So I'm going to be buying emerging country stocks more, and commodities, because emerging countries are both the biggest producers for export and the highest consumers compared to their income for commodities. So I think commodities are going to have the biggest boom in history, including gold and silver and stuff like that. So, but I've been bearish on gold for years, and I've won a lot of bets with gold bugs on that one so far.
Yeah.
I think you're going to see $700 in the next year or so, 400 minimum, maybe lower, and then gold could go to 4,000, but all gold bugs will be dead by then, 2030. That's the next commodity cycle peak. Commodities peak every 30 years like a clock. Yeah. 2038 to 40 is the next major commodity peak.
Well, guys, thank you. It's been extremely insightful. Thank you very, very much. I hope our audience got something out of that, and I look forward to having you back very soon.
Great. Thank you for having us.
Nice to meet you, Harry. Hey, Boris. Take care.
Thanks, Joe. Guys. Take care. Bye-bye.